What if the only hand in the whole country willing to give you water was the one hand your town had sworn you should fear and pulled you back from? What if a lone cowboy, standing over a well his own father had dug by lantern light, looked past every warning he had ever been handed and said, quiet as settling dust, "A man doesn't stand on his own porch and watch another man die of thirst." This is the story of a well that never once asked who was thirsty, of a band of Apache the town wanted turned back into the heat with empty gourds, and of the thing those same people did one killing winter that left every soul in Hollow Creek standing in the snow with their hats held against their chests. If you love emotional frontier stories filled with courage and kindness, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. Now, travel back to the Arizona territory of 1878, and let's get started. In the deep summer of 1878, the country around Hollow Creek stood at the ragged edge of two very different worlds. To the north and west lay the town, a double row of sun-bleached buildings with a church at one end and a livery at the other, and around it the small ranches of men who had come out to grow cattle and children in the dust. To the south rose the dry blue mountains, and in their folds moved the Apache, who had walked that land longer than any white man had a name for it. Between the two ran nothing but open ground, cracked riverbeds, and a fear so old that most people in Hollow Creek had stopped remembering where it came from and simply carried it the way they carried their canteens. It was a hard land where water was worth more than gold and trust was worth more than water, and where a man learned young that the country would take back everything you did not hold with both hands. The one place the two worlds brushed against each other was the trading post at the fork of the road, where a storekeeper named Amos Pell sold flour and shells and traded now and again with anyone who came with hides or silver, and where every rumor in the territory came to drink before it rode on. That summer the rumors were all of one thing. There had been no rain since the melt, the grass had gone to straw by June, and the shallow wells around town were sinking to mud. When land goes dry like that, fear rises the way heat does, straight up off the ground, and it looks for something to blame. Elias Wade, a 34-year-old cowboy, had spent nearly 20 years on the same 600 acres of hard yellow ground south of the creek, and he had built most of what stood on it with his own two hands. He was not a big man nor a loud one. He wore a hat gone the color of the country, and he answered questions with about half the words another man would use, and he had a way of finishing a day's work without ever once seeming to hurry through it. He had come out as a boy with his father, a lean and stubborn man who believed that any piece of ground could be made to keep a family if you were only willing to go down deep enough to reach what was under it. That was why, in the second dry year of Elias's boyhood, his father had picked a spot below the cottonwoods and started to dig, and had kept digging by lantern light long after the neighbors laughed and told him he would find nothing but more Arizona. At 40 feet, he found sweet water, cold and steady, water that in 20 years and 4 droughts had never once dropped below a man's reach. His father had leaned on the windlass that night, with his hands torn open, and told him the thing Elias would carry for the rest of his life. "A well doesn't ask who's thirsty before it gives," the old man had said. "You remember that. Water and mercy are the same thing wearing different clothes." His father was gone now, buried up the slope, and beside him lay Sarah, Elias's wife, who had died of a fever 3 winters back, and whom he had laid under the biggest cottonwood on the place because she had loved the sound the leaves made. He lived alone after that, alone but for a stubborn buckskin mare named Juniper, who followed him around the yard like a dog and would drink from the same dipper he did, and for a while it seemed the well and the grave and the mare were the whole of his world. He was not a bitter man for all his losses. He had simply gone quiet, the way a deep thing goes quiet, and he had kept the well clean and the fence tight, and had asked nothing of anyone, which in Hollow Creek was very nearly the same as being liked. By the middle of that summer, the well below Elias Wade's cottonwoods was the only good water in 20 miles, and everybody knew it. The Hollow Creek itself was a string of green pools going to scum. The town wells were down to a bucket of silt a day. Men came out to Elias's gate hat in hand, and he filled their barrels and never once named a price, because a price on water in a drought was the kind of thing his father had raised him to be ashamed of. So the town had reason to be grateful to him, and for a time it was, in its narrow way. But gratitude and fear can live in the same chest, and that summer the fear was growing faster than the gratitude, feeding on the heat, and on the empty sky, and on the sight of the dry mountains, where everyone knew the Apache were suffering the drought worse than anybody. The loudest of the frightened men was a neighbor of Elias's named Harlan Voss, a big red-faced rancher who had come out about the same time as the Wades and had never gone down deep enough for water and had never forgiven the country for it. Harlan Voss was not a cruel man at heart, but he was a scared one, and a scared man with a loud voice and a rifle can do more harm than a cruel one any day of the week. He had lost a brother to raiding years back, or said he had, and he wore that loss like a badge, and he polished it up bright every time talk turned to the mountains. "They'll come down when the last of their water goes," he would tell the men at the trading post, tapping the counter with one thick finger. "Thirst makes an animal of a man. When they come, they'll take what's ours, and they won't ask." And the men would nod, because it is easier to nod at a frightened man than to argue with him, and because the sky stayed white and the wells kept sinking, and something in all of them wanted a shape to give their dread. Amos Pell, the storekeeper, heard it all and mostly kept his own counsel, though he watched Elias Wade come and go with his water barrels and thought his own quiet thoughts about who in the country was truly worth being afraid of. Amos had been out longer than most of them, and he remembered a thing the young families did not, which was that the Apache had lived in these dry mountains for more lifetimes than anyone could count without ever once running out of water, which was not a thing you did in that country by luck. They knew where the deep seeps ran, and how to read a spring under a cottonwood, and how to move a whole people from one hidden water to the next through a summer that would kill a white man in a week, and Amos had always figured that a people who knew that much about staying alive in a hard land were a good deal more likely to teach you something than to murder you in your bed, whatever Harlan Voss said over the cracker barrel. But Amos also knew that a frightened man does not want teaching. He wants a wall and a rifle, and a story about the dark that makes the dark somebody else's fault, and so the storekeeper mostly weighed out his flour and held his tongue and watched the summer sharpen the whole valley toward something. He watched Elias Wade most of all. He had known Elias since the boy came out with his stubborn father, had watched him bury that father and then his young wife, had watched him go quiet and stay quiet, and almost had a notion, though he could not have put words to it, that the quiet in Elias Wade was not the quiet of a man who had given up, but the quiet of a well, deep and cold and steady, and holding a great deal more than showed at the top. He thought the country was going to reach down into that quiet before the year was out, one way or another, and find out what was really in it. He did not yet know how right he was, nor how much water was going to have to pass through that one man's hands, given away for nothing, before the whole valley learned the thing Amos Pell had always suspected, which was that fear is the only drought that a little kindness cannot break, until the day, all at once, it does. It was into that dry and waiting summer, with the whole land holding its breath, that the thing happened which would change every life around Hollow Creek. And it happened, as such things do, at the worst hour of the hottest day the year had yet made. It was past noon on a day when the heat came off the ground in sheets when they came down out of the hills. Elias was at the windlass hauling up water for Juniper and the few gaunt cows he had left when he saw the dust, And then under the dust, the people, moving slow the way people move when they have been walking a long time on too little. There were perhaps 40 of them, an Apache band, women and old men and children, and a handful of younger men walking wide on the flanks with their hands open and away from their sides so that anyone watching could see they carried the day peacefully. They had come to the trading post first, he learned later, and almost had given what water he could spare, which was little, and had told them the only steady well was down the south road at the Wade place. They had come the last 2 miles in the full sun. At the head of them walked an old man, straight-backed for all his years, with a face like a cliff worn smooth by weather, and near him a younger man of maybe 30, who carried a boy in his arms. The boy could not have been more than 6. His small head lolled against the man's shoulder, and his lips were cracked white, and Elias, who had watched his own wife go dry with fever, knew the look of a body running out of water when he saw it. He also saw, coming fast across the near pasture, Harlan Voss on his gray horse with his rifle already up out of the boot, and behind Harlan 2 or 3 other men who had seen the dust and come running with their fear loaded and ready. Harlan reined in hard at the fence line and threw the rifle to his shoulder and shouted for the band to hold where they were, that this was white man's water and they could turn themselves right back around. The younger Apache man stopped. The whole band stopped, gone still as stones in the terrible heat, and the boy in the man's arms made a small dry sound that carried across the yard. It is a strange thing about a moment like that, how long it can stretch, how a man can feel the whole shape of the rest of his life turning on what he does in the next breath. Elias Wade set down the dipper he was holding. He walked, unhurried, past Harlan Voss's leveled rifle and out through his own gate, which he swung wide open, and he crossed the last of the ground to the man with the boy. "Give him here," he said. And when the man hesitated, Elias said the only sentence he would say that whole afternoon that anybody remembered. Said it quiet, and flat, and final. Not to the Apache, but to Harlan and the men behind him. A man doesn't stand on his own porch and watch a child die of thirst. Then he took the boy in his own arms, carried him to the well, and dipped the dipper full of cold, sweet water, and held it to the cracked small mouth while 40 thirsty people and 4 frightened men watched him do it. He did not stop with the boy. When the child had drunk and coughed and drunk again, and turned his face against Elias's shirt and begun, faintly, to sweat, which is the first sign a dried body has found the bottom of its need, Elias handed him gently back to the young man, and then he simply went to work. He hauled water. He filled the long trough at the corral and stood aside and let the women bring the old and the small to drink. And he filled every gourd and canteen and skin they carried, working the windlass until his hands were raw, and he sent Juniper's own bucket down the shaft a dozen times over, and he never once asked any of them a question, or made any of them ask him. Behind him, Harlan Voss lowered the rifle at last, not because his fear had gone, but because there was no longer anything to point it at, and after a while he turned the gray and rode off without a word, and the 2 or 3 men with him went with him. Elias barely marked them going. There was water to be got up out of the ground, and there were people who needed it. And to him that afternoon the arithmetic of the thing was just exactly that simple, whatever every other soul in Hollow Creek would decide it meant. It cost him, and he knew it would. A well is not a spring. It is a debt against the ground that the ground pays back slowly, and 40 people and their stock drank down, in one afternoon, what would take his well the better part of a week to make good. In a summer when a week's water was a hard thing to lose. He knew that, and he drew it up anyway, because his father's voice was in the back of his skull, and because the boy had put his damp face against him and gone to sleep. When the band had drunk their fill and filled everything they carried, the old man with the worn cliff face came and stood before Elias, and looked at him a long time out of eyes that had seen more than one white man's rifle. And then he said something in his own tongue that the younger man turned into English. "He says he will not forget the well that opened," the young man said. "He says a thing given at cost is remembered longer than a thing given easy. He says, we will speak again." Elias did not know what to make of it, and he did not try to. He said only that they were welcome to what he had, and he watched them go back the way they had come, up toward the dry blue mountains, 40 people moving slow across the shimmering ground until the heat swallowed them, and he had no idea that he had just made the truest bargain of his whole life. The town found out by supper, the way the town found out everything, and by the next morning the story had grown teeth. Elias Wade, they said, had thrown open his gate to the Apache. Elias Wade had watered near 50 of them at the only good well in the country, while decent families rationed to a bucket a day. By the time the tale had gone around Hollow Creek a few times, it had become a conspiracy, as fear always builds itself a story to live in. He had made a deal with them. He was letting them scout his neighbor's stock. He had gone strange out there alone since his wife died. Everybody had always said so, and now the strangeness had turned to something worse. Harlan Voss went from house to house with it, and the more he talked, the more frightened he made himself, until he half believed the raiders of his boyhood were camped just over the next ridge, waiting on Elias Wade's signal. Amos Pell heard every version of it across his counter, and one afternoon, when Elias came in for shells and coffee, he told him plainly what was being said, because Amos was a decent man and reckoned a fellow ought not be ambushed by his own neighbor's talk. "They're saying you've thrown in with them," Amos said, weighing out the coffee without looking up. "Voss especially. He's got half the valley believing you'll wake them all up murdered in their beds on account of one afternoon's water." Elias took his coffee and his shells and settled his hat. "A man can believe what he likes," he said, which was about the longest speech Amos ever got out of him on the subject, and he rode home and said nothing to anyone and went back to hauling water for the town families, who still came to his gate even while they repeated the stories about him behind their hands, because Elias Wade did not hold a man's fear against his thirst. And the Apache did come again. They came every week or so through the long, dry summer, always in daylight, always with their hands open, and always it was the boy who ran to him first. A bright, quick child they called Little Cloud, who lost his shyness faster than the grown ones, and took to following Elias around the yard the way Juniper did, laughing at the mare, and at the way the tall, quiet cowboy pretended not to notice him. The young man's name was Chaco, and he had a little English from a mission school and used it to trade small talk with Elias while the women drew water, about the country and the weather and the animals, careful ordinary words that were really the slow, patient work of two strangers deciding they could stand each other. Trust, it turned out, was built the same way his father had built the well, one hard foot at a time, straight down, in a place where everyone said there was nothing worth reaching. The small things were what did it, the way the small things always are. There was the afternoon Little Cloud would not come near the mare until Elias set the boy up on Juniper's broad, warm back and led them both slow around the yard, the child gone stiff with terror, and then loose with delight. And after that the boy called the mare by a word in his own tongue that Chaco said meant something close to yellow with a soft mouth, and Juniper, who suffered almost no one, would drop her head to be scratched the moment the boy came through the gate. There was the day one of the young men, a shy one who had never once spoken to Elias, left a haunch of fresh antelope on the porch step without a word, and was gone before Elias came out. And Elias understood that a gift had been made, and made no more of it than to salt the meat down and be grateful, because he understood by then that these were a proud people, and that pride, in a hard country, is only another name for keeping your accounts square. There was the old woman, the headman's wife, who watched Elias the longest and trusted him the last, and who one September evening pressed into his rough hands a pair of moccasins she had beaded herself against the coming cold, and turned away before he could find a way to thank her that would not shame them both. And there were the long, slow talks with Chaco at the well while the water came up, about which draws held brows after a dry summer, and how to read a coming storm off the way the birds flew, and where, in the bad years, a man might still find grass, ordinary careful words that were the real deep work of two strangers laying down the timber of a thing that would have to bear weight later. Elias took to leaving the gate unlatched. That was the whole of it. In the end, that a man who had closed himself off after his wife died had gone and left his gate unlatched for people the whole town told him to fear, and had found on the other side of it something he had not known he was still missing. By the end of that summer, the thing at the Wade place had become more than water. The band had taken to camping a few miles off in a canyon where a seep still ran, and Elias fell into a rhythm with them, and the town watched it curdle their fear into something that needed doing. It came to a head on a gray, still morning in the first week of September, when Harlan Voss and a dozen men rode out to the Wade place with their rifles across their saddlebows, meaning to put a stop to it, and found the Apache band already there at the well, come for their week's water. What might have happened next is the thing Hollow Creek argued about for years, because it never did happen. The two lines formed the way such lines always form, a dozen frightened white men on their horses along the fence, and the young Apache men easing their women and children back behind them, both sides gone silent and stiff, and the whole dry morning balanced on a hair. And into the middle of that ground walked Elias Wade, on foot, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, and he stood square between the two lines where a wrong word from anybody would put a bullet through him first. He did not make a speech. He looked at Harlan Voss a long moment, and then he looked past him at the men, and he said, "There's a well here, and there's thirsty people. That's all there's ever been." And then the old man with the worn cliff face, the headman, got down off nothing, for he had no horse, and walked out from among his own people with both his empty hands held open and visible, an old man moving slow and unafraid straight into the range of a dozen rifles, until he stood beside Elias in the middle of the open ground. He said something, and Chaco spoke it into English for the whole valley to hear. He says a man who will not lower his own gun should not ask another to lower his. He says he has come out first, in front of his people, so that you can see there is nothing in his hands. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, Harlan Voss, whose fear had brought him this far, and could carry him no further against the sight of an unarmed old man, standing quiet in front of him, let the barrel of his rifle sink down slow until it pointed at the dirt, and he turned his gray horse and rode off the way he had come, and one by one the men behind him followed, and no shot was ever fired at Hollow Creek that day, or, on account of that morning, for a long time after. That evening the old headman sat with Elias on the porch step in the cooling dark, and through Chaco he told the cowboy the rule his own father had once given him. "A kindness given one time may only be chance," the old man said. "A kindness given twice may be a trap set with patience. But a kindness proven through hardship, given when the giving costs everything and there is nothing to be got back, that kindness a man may finally trust. We have not yet seen your hard season, Wade. When it comes, we will see what your well is made of, and so will you." Then he rose, and the band went back to their canyon, and Elias sat a long while alone in the dark, turning the old man's words over, not knowing how soon the country meant to test them. He thought about his father that night, the way he thought about him whenever a thing came clear that the old man had said long ago, and he had only half heard at the time. When the giving costs everything, and there is nothing to be got back. That was the well his father had dug, wasn't it, 40 feet down through ground that had promised nothing. On nothing but the stubborn faith that mercy and water were the same thing wearing different clothes, and that both were down there if a man would only go deep enough. Elias had not once in 20 years doubted the well. He found now, sitting on the cold step with the stars hard and white overhead and the dry mountains a black wall to the south, that he did not doubt the old headman either, and he could not have told you why, except that a man who will walk out first, in front of his own people, straight into the mouth of a dozen rifles with nothing in his hands, is a man whose word you find you can lean your weight against. The country did not care what Elias believed. All through October the last of the drought held on, and the well stayed low, and the town went on saying what the town said, and Harlan Voss went on being afraid, and Elias hauled water for whoever came and left his gate unlatched, and got his few cattle ready as best he could for a winter he could feel coming in the slant of the light and the early bite in the mornings. He did not know it would be the winter that broke the country. But he had lived in that land long enough to know that the seasons keep their promises, and that a land which has burned you dry all summer is only getting ready to freeze you through, and that a wise man lays by what he can, and prays the laying by is enough. It was not going to be enough. Nothing Elias Wade had was going to be enough for the winter that was coming, and the only thing that would carry him through it was the one thing he had given away for free on the hottest afternoon of the year, without ever once stopping to count the cost. The hard season came, as it always does in that country, wearing the opposite face of the one that had gone before. The drought broke at last in October, but it broke mean, in cold driving rains that did the parched ground more harm than good, and then in November the temperature fell out of the sky and did not come back up, and the winter of 1878 into 1879 set in as the worst that anyone around Hollow Creek could remember. The creek froze solid. Snow came down off the mountains in storms that shut a man in his own house for days, and the cold got into everything, and one bad thing led to another, the way they do when the country turns against you. In the first big blow, a lantern tipped in Elias Wade's barn, and the hay went up, and though he beat the fire down before it took the whole place, it took his winter feed, and the near half of the barn, and the better part of the stores he had laid by, and it left him going into the killing cold with his shelter breached, and his hay gone, and his few cattle already gaunt. Worse than any of it, the well went bad. The hard freeze cracked the old cribbing his father had set 40 years before, and the sweet water that had never failed in 20 years fouled with silt and grit until what came up in the bucket was too thick and bitter to drink, and there was no digging a new one out of ground gone iron hard with frost. So Elias Wade came into the deepest part of that winter, with his barn burned, his feed gone, his stock starving, and, cruelest of all, no water fit to drink on the one place in the country famous for its well, and he came into it alone, because the town had not forgiven him. The families that had drunk his water all summer now had water of their own again, and had gone back to their fear the moment they no longer needed his gate, and the story Harlan Voss had told all season had done its work, so that when Elias Wade's trouble came, not one soul from Hollow Creek rode out to help him. He melted snow over a smoking fire to keep himself and Juniper and the last cows alive, and he rationed the black bread that was all his stores had left him, and he doctored the burned corner of the barn with what he could pull from the wreck, and he did not ask anyone for anything, because there was no one to ask, and because asking was not a thing his father had taught him how to do. The days in that stretch of winter all ran together into one gray labor, up before light to break the ice on the water he had melted so the cattle could get at it, out in the wind to fork them what little browse he could scrounge from the drifts, back to the fire to thaw his hands enough to do it all again, and the nights were worse than the days, because in the nights there was nothing to do but listen to the wind find the burned gap in the barn, and worry the arithmetic of how many days of feed stood between him and losing the last of everything his family had built. He talked to Juniper more than a sane man ought to, the way lonely men will talk aloud to the one warm, living thing that will stand and listen, telling her they had seen worse, which was a lie, and that the cold would break soon, which he did not know, and the mare would lean her big head against his chest and breathe her hay-sweet breath at him, and it was, some nights, the only kindness in the whole frozen world. He went to the well every morning out of habit and hope both, and every morning it gave up the same fouled, bitter grit. And every morning something in him sank a little further, because a man can stand to lose a barn and stand to lose his stock and stand even to be shunned by his neighbors, but there is a particular despair in watching the one thing your father swore would never fail you go bad in your hands. Twice in that stretch, a family from town passed on the road within sight of his smoking chimney and did not turn in, and he watched them go by and felt the shunning of it, and said nothing, and went back to breaking ice. He was not angry at them. That was the strange thing he noticed about himself down at the bottom of that winter, that he could not find the anger a man was owed, only a great tiredness and, underneath it, so far down he could barely feel it, the same stubborn thing his father had gone into the ground with, the refusal to believe that doing the right thing was ever finally a mistake, no matter what the country charged you for it. There was one night in the middle of that stretch, in a blizzard so thick a man could lose his own barn 20 feet from the door, when Elias went out into it after a cow that had drifted and found instead an old Apache woman, half frozen in the snow at the edge of his land, thrown from the camp's way somehow in the storm. And he carried her in against the wind and thawed her by his poor fire, and gave her the last of his good coffee, and got her, warm and living again, and in the morning Chaco came searching and took her home, and Elias thought nothing more of it than that a person had needed help, and he had been there to give it. He did not know then who she was. He would learn that soon enough. They came on the third clear morning after the worst of the storms, and the whole valley saw them come. Elias was at his broken well, hauling up bucket after bucket of the fouled bitter water and straining it through cloth in a hopeless effort to keep his stock alive one more day. His hands split with cold, at the very bottom of what a man can carry. When Juniper threw up her head and whinnied, and he turned and saw the ridge. They came over it out of the south with the risen sun behind them, not the 40 of that first summer afternoon, but near twice that number. The whole band and more, men and women and old ones, driving a herd of shaggy winter-fat ponies and dragging travois piled high, and they came down the long snowfield toward the Wade place, slow and steady and unhurried, and the sight of them coming stopped the breath in Elias's chest. It stopped more than his. Word ran to town like fire, the way it always did, and by the time the band reached the burned barn, the fence line along the road was crowded with the people of Hollow Creek come out to see. Harlan Voss among them, every one of them certain, in the pit of their old fear, that they were watching the thing they had dreaded all along finally arrive. But no one who watched that morning ever forgot what they saw, because it was the opposite of everything the fear had promised. The Apache did not surround the Wade place. They came into it, and they went to work. The young men took axes and the half-burned timber and set to raising the barn back up out of its own ruin, and the women unpacked the travois and carried in winter stores, dried meat and mesquite meal and hides and grain for the stock, and stacked it where the burned stores had been. A dozen of them, led by Chaco, went to the fouled well with digging tools of bone and iron and began, in ground the town swore no man could break, to clear the cracked old cribbing and drive the shaft deeper, following the water down past the fouled place to where it ran clean. And by the short day's end, they had given Elias Wade a well better than the one his father had dug, and they drove their own ponies, 30 head of shaggy winter-hardened stock that could live on snow and browse where his soft cattle starved, into his corral and left them there. It is worth stopping on the town a moment, on the people crowded along the fence in the cold, because the thing that happened to them that morning was in its own quiet way the biggest thing that happened at all. They had come out braced for the nightmare they had fed all summer, come out expecting to watch the Wade place overrun, and instead, they stood in the snow and watched near 80 people who owed Hollow Creek exactly nothing spend a whole short winter day giving a shunned man back everything the season had taken from him and more, asking not one thing in return. Not payment, not thanks. Not even that anyone watching lift a single finger to help. They watched the barn go back up. They watched the well come clean. They watched the strangers they had feared work in the killing cold to save the one neighbor the town itself had left to die. And there is no fear so old and so stubborn that it can go on standing in front of a sight like that. A man near the middle of the fence, nobody ever agreed on who, was the first to take his hat off, and then it went down the line the way water finds its level, hat after hat coming off in the cold, grown men standing bareheaded in the snow with their breath smoking and nothing at all to say. Because there is nothing to say when a thing you have been wrong about your whole life walks up in broad daylight and shows you plainly how wrong you were. Through all of it, the old headman stood beside Elias in the trampled snow, and when the light began to go, he took the cowboy by the arm and led him to the young man Chaco and the boy Little Cloud, and he told him, at last, the thing he had been holding since summer. "The child you carried to your well on the hottest day," Chaco said, turning the old man's words, "the boy whose life you dipped up out of the ground with your own hands, that boy is his grandson, and my son. The old woman you carried out of the storm is his wife, my mother. You have twice now given water and warmth to his own blood without ever knowing whose blood it was, and that, he says, is the only kind of kindness a man may finally trust, a kindness that does not know who it helps." Then, the headman spoke his offer plainly. The way the profile of a mountain is plain, and it was not a debt paid off, but a thing meant to last. His people knew this country's hidden water, the seeps and the deep springs under the cottonwoods that no drought had ever touched, and they would share that knowing with Elias. And the good well would be open to the band in the dry times, as it had been open on that first day, and Wade Land and the band would stand to each other from that winter on, as one people stands to another it has decided to trust. Elias Wade listened to all of it, and when it was done he did not make a speech either. He looked at the deeper well, and the raised barn, and the ponies in his corral, and the town gone silent along his fence, and he said only, "My well never once asked who was thirsty. Seems only right, it never learns to start." And out along the road, one by one, the people of Hollow Creek took off their hats. It did not all mend at once, because life is not a story that ties itself off clean. And the truest part of what happened that winter was how slow the last of it came. Some in Hollow Creek never did come all the way around, and carried their fear to their graves out of pure stubbornness, the way a man will keep a grudge warm long after he has forgotten what it was for. And Harlan Voss, who had stood at the fence that morning and watched the thing he feared reveal itself as the thing that saved his neighbor, did not fall on his knees and repent, because men like Harlan Voss almost never do. What he did was harder and truer than that. It took him a full month before he could bring himself to ride out to the Wade place at all, and when he came without a word of apology, only with his wagon bed full of feed sacks he could ill spare, and he set them down by the rebuilt barn and stood a while with his hat in his hands, not knowing what to say, and Elias, who did not need him to say it, only nodded and helped him unload. It took the better part of a year before Harlan Voss could sit at the band's fire in the canyon without his shoulders up around his ears, and longer still, near 2 years before the night came that Little Cloud said something quick and funny in his careful English, and the big red-faced rancher who had raised a rifle at a dying child threw back his head and laughed out loud in the firelight. And it was that laugh, more than the barn or the well or the ponies, that told Elias the winter was finally over. The children were ahead of all of them, as children always are. Little Cloud and the town children took to running the creek bottom together within the month, and never once, as far as anyone could tell, stopped to ask each other's leave to be friends. The arrangement the old headman had spoken on the porch that first September, and sealed in the snow that winter held, and it grew, and it outlived both of the men who made it. In dry years the band came to the Wade well, and were welcome, and in every year the band's knowledge of the country's hidden water kept the whole valley alive through droughts that would have broken it before, until the day came, not so many years on, that Hollow Creek stopped being able to remember clearly why it had ever been afraid at all, which is the very best thing that can happen to a fear. Elias Wade lived another 31 years on that ground, and he saw a great deal in them. He saw Little Cloud grow into a tall grave man who could find water in country that looked like death, and he saw that man's children run the same creek bottom their father had run, and he saw the old headman laid to rest at last up in the Blue Mountains, full of years, and he grieved him the way you grieve a man who has taught you the one thing you most needed to know. He kept the well clean all his life, and he kept his father's grave and Sarah's grave tidy under the big cottonwood, and in his last years the country came to call him a kind of old landmark, the quiet cowboy whose well had never failed and whose gate had never closed, though most who told it by then had the details wrong. He told the story himself only rarely, and there was one way of telling it he would not sit still for. Now and again some traveler or some young man raised on the old fears would want it to be a tale about savagery tamed, about how a brave lone rancher had faced down the wild men and won them over with his rifle and his nerve, and Elias Wade would get up from his chair the moment he heard it start to bend that way, and go out to his porch and look a while at the mountains, and not finish it for them, because that was not the story, and he knew exactly what the story was. The story was that a boy had been dying of thirst on the hottest day of a hard year, and a man had given him water without asking whose child he was, and that everything good that came after, the deeper well, the raised barn, the ponies in the snow, the fear that finally forgot its own name, all of it had grown up out of that one small, costly thing, the way his father's sweet water had grown up out of 40 feet of ground that everyone swore held nothing. So if you ever find yourself standing at your own gate, in your own hard season, with someone thirsty on one side of it, and every voice you know telling you to keep it shut, think a while on the cowboy and the well and the winter that amazed a whole town, and remember that mercy, like water, does its best and its lasting work only when it never once stops to ask, who is thirsty? If this story moved you, take a moment to like it and to subscribe so more stories like it can find you, and tell us in the comments what you would have done that day at the well, when the boy was dying and the rifle was up and the only right thing to do was also the hardest.